A breakthrough in cancer treatment could help 18 million US survivors and potentially boost biotech stock values. And all it takes is a little blood.
A new form of biopsy is being developed that is non-invasive. It requires only a blood test instead of the physical examination of a piece of tissue.
Cancer is the second leading cause of death in the United States, and rates are on the rise. In 2022, President Joe Biden reignited the Cancer Moonshot Initiative with ambitious goals, including reducing cancer death rates through improved prevention, detection, and treatment. $150 million in research grants were awarded in 2024 to spur biomedical innovation as part of that program.
The goal is to cut cancer death rates by at least 50% in the next 25 years.
For cancer patients, early treatment is key to survival. Advances in DNA sequencing have enabled biotech companies to develop blood tests, or liquid biopsies, that detect cancer relapses months earlier than traditional methods, driving a race to bring these tests to market. On this episode of Growth Stories, we take a look at the groundbreaking test that could revolutionize cancer detection and what investors need to know about this evolving market. The market for cancer relapse monitoring is expanding rapidly, with major biotech companies aggressively developing early detection tests.
There's a number of blood tests on the market that work with patients who have cancer, who might have cancer. There are minimal residual disease tests, and those will look for signs that cancer has returned in a patient who has already been treated.
That's IBD reporter Allison Gatlin. She says these minimal residue disease blood tests, also known as MRD, work by looking for DNA fragments shed by tumor cells.
Tumor DNA is different than human DNA. It's riddled with genetic mutations that wouldn't show up in your DNA otherwise. So when that shows up in a blood test, you can bet that there is cancer festering in that patient.
RBC Capital Markets equity analyst Connor McNamara says these MRD tests fall into three different categories.
One is screening, your basic, do you have cancer? The second is selection, which is targeted medicine or companion diagnostics, where you will be tested for a cancer that can be treated with a specific type of therapy. And finally, the third is surveillance. After you've been treated, how are you responding? Is your cancer coming back?
After a patient is diagnosed with cancer, the most common route is to attack it with surgery. Biotech firms like Guardant Health, Exact Sciences, and Natera can run that sample through their systems and come up with a set of mutations, or biomarkers, consistent with that cancer, but not the patient's own DNA.
A lot of these companies are going after the same cancer types. They're looking at lung cancer, breast cancer, and colorectal cancer because these are such big markets in the cancer space. So what they'll do is they'll try to make the most specific, most exact test that they possibly can.
Exact Sciences, Natera, and Guardant Health are emerging as the early market leaders. Exact Sciences is hoping to launch its MRD test called OncoDetect for colorectal cancer later this year. The company already produces a stool DNA-based cancer detection test called Cologuard.
It's there to replace what has historically been done via colonoscopy or a FIT test, which are invasive, or for FIT, you have to get it every year. So Cologuard disrupted that market for colorectal screening.
Natera makes Signatera, a surveillance test for breast cancer, while Guardant's Reveal looks for minimal residue disease associated with early-stage colorectal, breast, and lung cancers.
And then you've got a few other players. Tempus and Grail are two public companies, and then quite a few private companies that are out there that are trying to get into this market.
Analysts say the MRD test market could be worth up to $6.7 billion in the early 2030s. That opportunity is being driven by the sharp increase in the number of cancer diagnoses and, in turn, survivors. By 2040, the National Cancer Institute expects there will be 26 million cancer survivors in the U.S. Traditionally, doctors monitor for cancer recurrence through a variety of imaging tests. If a patient had breast cancer, they might undergo routine mammograms. Lung cancer patients will often receive semi-regular CT scans to look for new tumors. Other patients might undergo PET scans, but cancer can be unpredictable.
But the drawback to those is that you need the cancer to have grown large enough to actually show up on an imaging scan, which means that there is a tumor, as opposed to these blood tests, which will look for circulating tumor DNA in a patient's blood. So in that case, it's possible to catch it much earlier because the tumor hasn't grown big enough to be seen on a scan in that case.
Now, you're probably thinking, a simple blood test to detect disease. Where have I heard this before?
We have a vision and a dream for early detection and prevention, and we want to change our system in such a way in which early detection and prevention can become realities.
That was Theranos founder Elizabeth Holmes, speaking at a Vanity Fair event in 2015. The biotech startup claimed to offer comprehensive disease testing from a single drop of blood, but was later exposed as a fraud. But other companies aren't just making claims, they're turning blood-based cancer detection into a reality, with tests being rigorously evaluated in large clinical trials. Natera's Signatera test is highly accurate for colorectal cancer. Data from clinical studies show that the risk of cancer recurrence after a positive result was 97%. Tests looking at Exact Sciences also show promise. Results from an MRD surveillance study done by AlphaCorrect showed OncoDetect achieved 91% accuracy in colon cancer surveillance. Guardant's Reveal demonstrated a 100% specificity rate for breast cancer. And depending on the cancer type, blood tests can detect a relapse an average of 15 months before imaging scans. Despite clinical testing, several concerns remain regarding the use of blood tests for cancer detection. Liquid biopsies can be expensive, and experts worry that they could lead to unnecessary treatments. And most oncologists are hesitant to begin treatment till they see evidence on a scan.
We've seen this before where you may test for something, you get a positive result, but there's no therapy there. And so you've basically found an illness or a disease that if there's no treatment, why run the test?
False positives are also a concern with blood tests to detect cancer.
With these tests, if you come up with a positive result, a doctor will likely say that you need to undergo a different type of screening just to make sure, just to confirm that there is cancer in the body. But a number of experts I spoke with said, if it turns up positive on one of these blood tests, there is a very good chance that there is cancer festering in your body and it will return.
Given the immense market opportunity for cancer relapse monitoring blood tests, analyst Connor McNamara explains what factors will define a successful company in this growing field.
First, you have to have a very high quality test. You've got to be able to accurately predict cancer. And so the successful companies will have good data. Second, you've got to navigate regulatory bodies. You've got to go through the FDA. You've got to run a study to prove that your test has good data, will work, will predict disease.
McNamara adds that the cost of each test will also be a key differentiator in establishing a market leader.
A test that costs several $1,000s is not something the healthcare system can afford for every patient every year. So companies that are focused on getting their cost of goods down, I think will ultimately be successful. And that's a very key differentiator.
IBD reporter Allison Gatlin says that navigating healthcare bureaucracy will be a significant challenge to broader adoption.
You can get a test approved and doctors can prescribe it, but if insurance won't cover it, then the market size is really small. You're not going to have many patients who are willing to pay out of pocket without Medicare or commercial insurance taking care of the price for them. So reimbursement is a major key.
McNamara points out that liquid biopsy makers will also need to overcome the challenge of established diagnostic methods and secure physician buy-in.
So you're going into a physician or an oncologist and say, hey, I know you've done this your entire career, but now try this. And that's always a tough thing to sell to the physician.
While the total addressable market for these blood tests presents a compelling opportunity for investors, it's important to realize that these companies are not yet turning a profit, which is not unusual in the biopharmaceutical industry. Analysts don't expect Exact Sciences to notch its first profits until 2026. Natera is expected to follow in 2027 and Guardant in 2030. Given this lack of historical profits, McNamara suggests focusing on a company's enterprise value in relation to its revenue. He explains additional factors to consider.
One is just overall testing volume, and that comes from either the tests that you have on market or additional tests that are coming. And two is the cost. How much are you getting paid for the test?
He adds that product development is also important.
You want to invest in a company that has things coming down the pipeline. So, every earnings call, these companies will talk about certain trials they're in, and you want to have multiple shots on goal to expand into that market. And so those are the things that we look for outside of just financial metrics.
Investors should also be aware of the technology's novelty and the inherent unpredictability of biotech stocks. But IBD reporter Allison Gatlin says the emerging field holds a lot of promise.
It's interesting to see that there is a way of finding cancer in patients who have already gone through this this experience who've already been treated and are just hoping to move on with their lives. And rather than going through this mishmash of, different types of tests, across the medical landscape that might or might not be very straightforward, just going to the doctor, getting a blood test every 6 months to a year, however long doctors say you should, seems like the better option, the easier option, if it can be as specific and sensitive as imaging scans.
Ultimately, for these tests to be successful and for these tests to be paid for and for doctors to adopt, they need to have something that changes the treatment paradigm for a patient. And you need to have something on, at the end of the test that says, okay, well, here are your treatment options and this is what's going to work for you the best.